Sue Ball, the chair of the Thorney Island Society. Our Zoom talks over the past couple of years have always been pretty fascinating, and this evening is no exception. I mean, it's particularly topical because this week there was a report on statues in public art, and it's a first for Thorney Island Society this evening because we have two speakers, two for the price of one. Melissa, Joe and Montaz came together because of their mutual love of history and interest in commemoration. I think that's right, but Melissa Jo can tell me if I got that wrong. And is that going to be an absolutely fascinating talk with both of them, you know, playing off against each other, setting context and really helping us focus on commemorative art in Thorney, public art on Thorney Island. And they're going to have a particular way of dealing with questions, and they'll explain that to us as they introduce themselves. So it's going to be absolutely fascinating. And if I can ask Melissa, Joe to start off, that would be terrific. Okay, thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Sue. That's a lovely introduction. And before I put my presentation and share my presentation with you all, I would just like to give props to Victor Keegan, who has been instrumental in introducing Montaz and I to one another, albeit indirectly through via the author Joe Langston, who is writing about Ignatius Sancho, which is one of Vic's special subjects, and also a Thorney Island connection as well. We formed a little group called the Sanchonettes, and we're meeting to talk about Ignatius Sancho. And Joe Langston said, "You've got to meet this amazing woman, Montaz Marché," and I then contacted Montaz, and the rest is history. We've been working together, I can't remember how many years now. Is it about 3 or 4 years?
3, definitely. Montaz. Yeah, probably something like that. Yeah.
So that's really great. Thank you, Victor. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully the Wi-Fi is going to be absolutely fine. I'm a little bit nervous because I am in the middle of nowhere. So it has been a bit patchy. So someone will have to alert me somehow using carrier pigeon or something if it's no good. So who are we? What are we doing? And what's this all about? So this is, as you all know, I'm really impressed that everybody's here as well. I'm very excited that we've got such a good audience, because I know things are happening in the wide world that may have taken people's attention away. So thank you very much for being here. So who are we? I am Melissa Jo Smith. I'm a writer and a producer. I have a community interest company called Illuminated Arts. We have 3 directors, but I'm the creative director. And what we do at Illuminated Arts is use the arts to re-engage with history and dig up particularly lost and hidden history. So women's history, Black history, queer history, the history that's really not usually told. And we've been working with prisons, we've been working with schools, we work with community groups and residence groups, and we do all kinds of different heritage projects. And I've taken to calling myself a heritage activist lately, and I know that word activist is a little bit of a worry to some people, in that it usually conjures up images of, you know, violence or, you know, demonstrations and protest. And I think, you know, there is certainly a place for that in heritage activism in terms of protest, but I definitely not. That's not my bag. And what I prefer to do is to engage with people. And I think it's much more interesting if you can get inside a school and talk to the young people, for example, and get them to think about things and get them to see that things are not black and white. You know, you don't have to pick a side. You don't have to be, to get them to do some critical thinking. It's much more interesting. It's quite hard to get into schools, I would say, but I think it's actually where it's at. So that's me. Montaz.
Hi, I am Montaz. I am a writer and a historian, and I'm currently doing my PhD at the University of Birmingham. I specialise in Black British history, and particularly in the 18th century, but I also look at women's history. And just like Melissa Jo, I aim to try to kind of disseminate knowledge and history from kind of academic spheres and move them into more public spheres so that everyone kind of has access to a lot of information, and also work in a very public dynamic to ensure that people recognize the various histories that layer London, layer the whole country, and that we can kind of all acknowledge the wide-ranging communities that we've built in this country over hundreds of years. So yeah, that is me. I'll hand back over to Melissa Jo.
So I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea of what we're doing in the talk. Sorry, I've got the slides the wrong way around. So what we're aiming to do, and we did say in the blurb, you know, an idea of what we're doing, but I just wanted to sort of go into that a little more. So the reason we want to do, and we approached the Thorney Island Society to do the talk, was really to look at how what it says about our society when we have commemorative art, particularly of people, the people that we choose to commemorate, and why, and what it says about who we are as a people, as a society, and also what it says about what we want to commemorate and what we want to show. So the people who chose the art and why they were their heroes, I suppose. So to look at the different eras of fashion that have happened, and when different people were commemorated, and who chose them, and also the where and what that says. So the placing of statues and how that's and what that says about what we're trying to say and what we're trying to show. So it's the who, the why, and the where, I suppose, really, of statues and commemoration. And also getting us all to challenge ourselves slightly in terms of our thinking as to what we accept, what we think is okay, what we want to do in the future. So we'll be looking at the past, the present, and the future of commemoration. And I suppose I'm looking to you as esteemed members of Thorney Island to, I suppose, challenge your own thinking, and also what you think that we should be talking to the next generation about as well. So what we can do in our lifetimes about the commemorative art that is around us and how we engage with it. So I don't know how deeply I really want to go into who's already here in Thorney Island and who is commemorated. I will give you a little bit of scope. I'm sure you are all familiar with this because this is very much the subject that Thorney Island engages with. But I do think it's quite interesting because of the where Thorney Island is placed in terms of the world stage, that who is commemorated within Thorney Island. So, and I think that probably as a whole, the way that these statues have been chosen and these people as heroes and heroines have been chosen is significant. I think it shows the fashion. I think it speaks to a wider fashion in Britain. You know, you have kings and queens, so you have George V and you've got Queen Anne, as you would expect to have royalty. But you also have artists, you have Purcell, you have statesmen and thinkers and people who've established new ways of doing things, like Robert Peel. I think that you also have people who were known as activists themselves. You have the suffragettes, Emmeline Pankhurst, and you have also people who were very much part of the establishment, but themselves initiated critical thinking. You've also got, I mean, the art that is shown here, the Burgers of Calais, it's not just about the artist. I think it's also about the message that story and that narrative sends. So the narrative of the Burgers of Calais is that, of course, these were the heroes. These were the people who came to save their community and were spared. So interesting that it's here because, of course, the bad guys were the British people in that story, and the good guys were the Burgers of Calais who offered themselves to the English to save their community. So the narratives that we get from these stories and we get from these images, I think, are really important in terms of the message that we send. You also have, of course, the so-called Buxton Memorial about the emancipation of slaves, which you could, if you didn't know and you didn't see this plaque, you could easily miss. You wouldn't necessarily know that there was anything that connected it with the issues and ideas about slavery. But if you know, you know, of course, and we know that it was quite probably quite a controversial thing when it was erected at the time. And actually, that's another thing that joins the statues of Thorney Island together, is that often it's taken a huge campaign to get these people commemorated for one reason or another. Of course, in Parliament Square, you have the politicians and the public establishment. And again, having, for example, Gandhi commemorated in Parliament Square and having Nelson Mandela, although this at that point they had been reclaimed as heroes, that was quite a significant point in time to get those statues. And they are, as I'm sure it won't surprise you, the only statues of people of colour that we could find in Thorney Island. Please, by the way, we are going to be having opportunity for people to tell us things that we don't know. Our research is not definitive on this. We've done our best, and Jules has very kindly sent me a link to something that was very timely, which has some information about the statistics of UK statues broadly. So I'm going to get to that in a minute. But just in terms of the stats for the Thorney Island commemorations, we found 11 men, if we don't count the Burgers of Calais as more than one. We'll count them as one, I think, but 11 men, 3 women, 2 people of colour. So statistic wise, I think that probably is quite similar to the UK stats, which I'll come to in a minute. And also in terms of the artists, we could only find 1 woman artist. I haven't checked out the ethnicity of everybody, all of the artists, but I think they are mostly, 19 of them were white men. Not to make too many assumptions. So again, I know you're highly interested and educated people, and I'm not going to talk to you too much about Churchill and about David Lloyd George, because I'm sure you know about them and who they are and who they were, rather. But you may not know that Jan Smuts, who is here on the right, was actually erected because Churchill thought he was somebody who should be memorialized. And again, there was a lot of discussion about where his statue would go. And in the end, Churchill opted for Parliament Square, which in the 1950s was quite a significant thing. Now, I say obviously, but I think looking at it in the context of 2022, Jan Smuts, who was the founder of apartheid in South Africa, who was also believed in and wrote almost the textbook for white supremacy, was an interesting choice for Winston Churchill. And I think it's quite interesting that Churchill's racism is targeted in recent years, but Jan Smuts not so much. And of course, he's not somebody that a lot of younger people will know about, but it's not hard to find out about him, and yet his statue remains. So that's an interesting conundrum, I think. And I have my views on it, but perhaps we can talk about this later on. I don't want to take too much on this. So I'm now going to hand over to Montaz to talk about the present.
Well, thank you, Melissa Jo. So what we were kind of thinking about is how above public art, statues are the most accessible. They're the most common, they're the most kind of visual, the ones that we encounter quite frequently, even when we don't intend to, particularly walking the streets of London. And as Melissa Jo just mentioned, that the statistics, particularly regarding London, are quite telling of representation in terms of these figures, these commemorations in public art. So of the 1,500 statues in London, they represent specific individuals in history or society, and some of them are also symbolic, representing a few communities, events, or ideals. But there's 100 depicted animals and only 50 depicted women, with 19 recorded women who were royals, and with only 2 women who were women of colour, and those being Mary Seacole and Noor Inayat Khan. Mary Seacole, I'm sure you know, was the doctress and nurse in the 19th century who assisted in the Crimean War alongside Florence Nightingale. And Noor Inayat Khan was the British resistance and espionage agent who worked in France during World War II and served as in the Special Operations Executive. Now, many of the male figures I'm sure we all know, are kind of royalty, of politicians, military figures, writers, artists, and there are 9 that depict men or boys of colour. But what's interesting as well is that these statues were erected in the last 2 centuries, well, most of them were. So according to these statistics, 22.5% were made in the 19th century and 73% were made in the 20th and 21st century. And it's easy to imagine when you look at statues, because they've been a constant present in our lives, that they're as old as London themselves. But actually their constructions and the ideals that they represent are newer than we think, and are still fervent in society, despite the fact that a lot of our personal and social ideals are changing. And based on these statistics alone, the creation of public art does not fully represent the inclusive London society. There are serious gaps in intersectional representation, particularly for cultures, of classes, and of gender identities. But this is not because London's history lacks these figures or these events to commemorate. As Pippa Catterell at LSE says, these statues represent what the elite who controlled these spaces then considered important, as statements about themselves and their society. Now, as Melissa Jo was just saying, the Thorney Island possesses many public art commemorations that immortalise important individuals, events, and ideals that have come to define British politics and society. So they are aptly placed. But in the same way, they also reflect the statistics that this report has just kind of highlighted, the lack of diversity and gender inclusive representation. And we're missing much. And many of the individuals represented barely scrape the surface of what London and the country in itself, important and trailblazing communities, legislations, and actions that have happened. In terms of as well of what the people that encounter the space of Thorney Island, it is a significant place of power, of authority, of lawmaking, and it houses daily those who are highly influential, as well as tourists who are highly influenced by these commemorations, as well as kind of everyday people who encounter the space. And so we have to think about who is represented, why, who made them, and how far does the public art represent the diverse range of accomplishments achieved and individuals in this space. And this is a historic problem as well, this issue of public art and its relationship to memory. So statues have been placed and replaced frequently throughout history as a means of conditioning ideas of what is remembered. So an example is during the colonization of Africa, when the British took over the German East Africa during World War I, they replaced the statue of Herman von Wistman. And there's, I'm sure we can all think of other examples throughout history, not just in terms of Britain, but across the world, where these statues have been taken down and replaced with other things. But this is an issue that rises again in the present. I don't know, Liz Jo, if you could switch to that other slide that we just had. Thank you. And so for many of us who spend years walking the streets of London, witnessing these statues now permeate the public consciousness as we engage with how these statues actually define or represent or shape our public space. Statues force us to question what they are, how we are using them to interpret history and society, and how far these statues represent the histories and individuals that we treasure today and represent us in ourselves. I mean, fine examples here are the Edward Colston statue in Bristol that was taken down during the Black Lives Matter movements, or the Cecil Rhodes statue in Oxford. And in the glorification of these individuals, what is represented is, in one way, their personal achievements that someone has deemed important enough to embody in a statue. So I suppose for Colston, it would be his merchant history and him as a Tory MP, or as with Rhodes as the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. But also what's represented, and not necessarily highlighted, but ingrained within this commemoration, is the glorification of those who engaged in slavery, in colonization, and the dehumanization of Black lives throughout history. But this is the difficulty when considering statues as these physical objects of memory, as they become kind of frozen in time or atemporal and do not change with the world. And beyond that, there's only so much that can be represented within the physical form of a statue, right? They're often kind of represented as hero worship or commemoration to capture this glorification of an achievement or contribution. And they are infrequently contextualized to represent all aspects of that individual's history. And when not contextualized, they distort our perception of that individual's life, their humanity, and their connection to the present. Overall, we remember this greatness out of context, and despite the fact that these statues do actually house dark elements of the past that are awakened, and that awaken harsh and jarring experiences for those who still live in the wake of these dark elements of our past, for example, slavery, as the Black Lives Matter movement highlighted. So it's important that public art memorializes not a singular narrative of this kind of top-down glory, but of an inclusive one that recognizes all elements of the past and every kind of person who has made this nation's, and London specifically, history what it is. And so we're becoming much more aware of how statues and public art need to become more inclusive to ensure that history commemorates and engages with the complex history of our past, and in a way parallels the London's diverse community of the past and the present. So, for example, the National Trust's blue plaques have, there's been a lot of campaigning about ensuring that they represent people of colour and people from various other communities. Statues that are newly being erected. So, for example, Nicola Adams is one that's going to be erected, who was if you don't know, the Olympic women's boxing champion. Or recently, the National Windrush Monument erected in Waterloo Station. And as Sadiq Khan says, the London's diversity is its greatest strength. But for far too long, our capital statues, street names, and buildings have only shown a limited perspective of our city's complex history. So we have to kind of examine our role as history makers in creating statues and choosing histories that are commemorated, particularly when we engage with public arts, when we see public art as a conversation between the past and the present. And we want to emphasize some important points that in the first place, when in regards to statues and their public arts relationship with history, there's this automatic assumption that statues link directly to or illuminate directly this history. But when actually they're kind of the symbolic testament to collective memory. But they are memorializations, statues themselves are memorializations of power and of authority of the past and the present. They're not in their entirety or in isolation engagements with the history themselves. And so when we see the erection of new statues, for example, Mary Seacole's or the Windrush, or more recently the mother and child statue, we see statues begin to evolve and recognize the shift in power relations and the narratives in society as the public and public institutions begin to collate the more inclusive, more diverse narratives that are significant to all of us. But that's the creation of new statues. What about the statues that are already present? Now, this shift in position comes with the recognition that those statues are only, I suppose, symbolic of history and of memories themselves. They are touchstones to history. They are entry points to invite conversation, illumination, and contextualization, and that engage with this inclusive history that of what is immortalized in these statues, both of the, in this case, individuals, but also the wider history in itself. And it requires us to think more critically and more creatively about how we can use and historicize statues as living resources, rather than kind of these fixed points of commemoration. And I suppose as well, this is sort of what this talk is hoping to engage, is kind of that critical and creative mind to think about kind of positions in space, materials, structures, how we attract attention from passers-by, and how we can specifically use technological capacities to support the educative nature and the manner that public art has of attracting attention or drawing attention to particular individuals or points in history. And so with that, I suppose I can hand back to Melissa Jo to kind of talk about the opinions on statues and the future of how we can use statues to represent a more inclusive history.
Thank you, Montaz. So we thought we'd ask the young people, really, because the young people that we've been working with will have a very different view and a very different understanding of what these things mean. So the future, they are the future. The first project that we started working on together was with the Mongers company. Now, the Mongers is obviously one of the city's companies. As you probably know, they were formed, actually, I don't know which century, I can't think, it might be 14th or 13th century, long time ago, to protect the interests of the city traders. And I happened to know quite a lot about a chap called William Beckford. So for those of you who haven't heard of William Beckford, he was twice Lord Mayor of London. He was known as the richest man in England in the 18th, sort of early and mid 18th century. He was a white Jamaican who had a strong Creole accent, and who was criticised and ridiculed for having it. And in many ways, he was proving people wrong. He was new money. He wasn't from an established old name. He wasn't from one of the powerful families of Britain. He made his money in Jamaican sugar plantations. And as I'm sure you can guess, that involved exploiting the labours of many hundreds, if not thousands, of enslaved Africans. And so he is commemorated there in the Ironmongers Company. You're probably familiar, if you know him at all, with the other statue, which is in the Guildhall. And the Guildhall has been engaging with the idea of whether they should remove his statue because of this connection with slavery. And it's not a loose connection with slavery. I mean, he was slavery. He is the face. He is the face of 18th century slavery, if you like, and wealth, and how that was, how that played out, and catapulted him into the power brokers of British society at the time. The Guildhall met and talked and discussed and decided to remove the statue, at which point the government stepped in and I think said they couldn't. So that is a very public facing statue. The Ironmongers statue is a private statue. It belongs to the Ironmongers Company, and they had no reason at all to engage with us. They had nothing to gain from, they could easily have said no, but instead they welcomed us with open arms and said, we absolutely would love to engage with people about this statue. The Beckfords didn't give any money to the ironmongers, although William Beckford was an ironmonger, but they didn't make profits from his slavery as such. But they were still very willing and interested to engage with the subject, and invited us to come and talk to them. The lady that you see here is Jackie Beckford, and she is, her ancestry and heritage is Jamaican, and quite likely had some connection to the enslaved people on the plantations in that Beckford owned, although not necessarily. It's not that clear cut, and it's very complex, as I'm sure you can imagine. So Jackie Beckford is a BSL translator. She's also an actor and creative. And so we brought Jackie on board for this project because we wanted to engage with them by doing a project with Beckfords and about the Beckford name. The idea being that many, many white British people don't really have any idea about plantation names and don't know about the associations and don't know why they might hear the same names amongst their Caribbean friends or the people that they meet, that those plantation names have a resonance and a meaning. And I suppose also for myself, it was something that I was shocked to learn at quite a late age. I think I was probably in my 20s when I really, or might even been older, when I first realized that my friend's surname, my friend's family name was actually belonging to a plantation owner who was known as the Brute of St. Kitts. He was one of the worst, one of the most vile and depraved plantation owners, who was known and had a reputation for being particularly brutal. And this is a pretty brutal world to start with in terms of plantation. So that must have been quite the reputation to gain. So we wanted to do a project about the name of Beckford, and we also then engaged theologian Robert Beckford, who equally had heritage from the same source. So our first project that we did was part of a Black History Month event, which we had managed to get a grant for. And Montaz and I worked with a group of young people who were from South London secondary schools. They were in years 7 and 8, I think, weren't they, Montaz? They were, so that's, what is it, 11, 12, 13, that sort of age. And we it was virtual because this was during lockdown, but we got them to engage with the concept of William Beckford and started to do some digging and got them to do some research. And it's a fascinating narrative, the Beckford narrative. It's and it's almost symbolic, I think, of the waste of all of that enslaved labour. So William Beckford Senior, who you see here depicted, was the one who was twice Lord Mayor of London, but he died very suddenly in I think it was 1774 or 1770, and he left his wealth to his only legitimate son. Apparently he had a great many illegitimate children who he never recognised and didn't leave anything to. But his son, also William Beckford, never visited Jamaica, never visited the plantations, but was extremely wealthy. And like many of the wealthy established families at the time, he did the grand tour throughout Europe, and he used this opportunity to collect the most fabulous objects, many of which are in the V&A today. And he then, with his vast wealth, he was a writer. He wrote Gothic novels, and he was a dilettante, essentially. He built a huge tower which just grew and grew and grew in proportion. I'm afraid I've forgotten the name of the architect. It's someone you will know, but it's popped out of my head. But this tower grew and grew without foundations. So the foundations essentially had not been dug to proportion, in proportion. He filled it with rent boys and continued to have what became quite an isolated life, spending his father's money. And again, never visited, never met any of the enslaved Africans who he profited from. And then the tower collapsed in spectacular style. There is a ruin still available and still something that it's privately owned, but you can visit it in Bath. But again, symbolically, this narrative is quite poignant. And because because in South London, I don't have the statistics, but the schools we were working with, lots and lots of the people who, the young people we were talking to, had Caribbean heritage or African heritage. So it spoke to them. They really engaged with this tale, and of course it had a meaning because it felt very personal. And one of the parts of this history that again became quite interesting to the young people was the fact that although, as I mentioned, the ironmongers didn't profit from Beckford's wealth, the founder of the Ironmongers Company, Geoffrey, who was one of the earlier ironmongers, of course, was one of the Africa Company's directors, and so had his wealth, of course, had been founded on slavery. So they certainly weren't able to say, look, we didn't take profits, because of course there was a great a connection to this. And if this is not too complicated, if we can then follow that trail from Beckford to Geoffrey to the Museum of the Home, which you might know has been rebranded and renamed as the Museum of the Home, but previously, and probably, well, certainly my generation knew it as the Geoffrey Museum. And those were the almshouses which Geoffrey bequeathed through the profits of slavery to the poor of London. And those are the almshouses that were then later bought by the Museum of the Home, which is why the Museum of the Home is now in hot water with the likes of Diane Abbott, for example, who does not think that the statue of Geoffrey should be placed in such a prominent place above the Museum of the Home. So following that trail, And there, it turns out that the Museum of the Home, who really have been under quite a lot of pressure to remove this statue, had also decided in their board that they were going to remove that statue. And then again, the government said they couldn't. So you have heritage, I wouldn't call them wars, but conflict. You have conflict about heritage at the highest level. Incidentally, the Museum of the Home have quite an elegant solution, because again, this comes to the who and the what and the where. So Beckford statue here in the Ironmongers in a private space, the other Beckford statue in a public space, which is the Guildhall. You have the Museum of the Home, which is used for family Christmas carol concerts, for example, and particularly that square in front of the Museum of the Home is used for family concerts. And then you have Colston, of course, who was in the middle of Bristol shopping centre. So where people, the public and the private being very significant into where we're encountering these statues. And again, what people will feel and how they make people feel. So personally, when I walk past Jan Smuts, it makes me feel something, you know. I feel it's not a pleasant feeling. And again, having Geoffrey commemorated in the Museum of the Home, again, a very public, but also a very symbolizing a private space like the home. I feel that the elegant solution that the director has proposed, which is to move the statue to Geoffrey's grave, which is also near the grounds of the Museum of the Home. I think that's an elegant one. It also turns out it's not the original. So the government in that instance are protecting a copy of the original, which the original I think is somewhere in Kent. I can't remember why it was removed. So interesting. Anyway, I'm going on a bit. Sorry, I'm going to, because to me, it's a fascinating trail of research. But so our projects with the young people in South London, and you have to bear in mind that this is a Black History Month event, so we were focusing very much on Black history. And as you may or may not be aware, Black history as taught in schools is often very focused on American Black history. And we have a rich and diverse Black history in this country. And we felt that it was a good way to get young people thinking about British Black history. So I think this is Montaz's brilliant idea. We asked them to compare and contrast one of their Black British heroes from the present with a Black British hero from the past, and they had to find them themselves and research them. And it really, I found it really surprising. I think Montaz, you would say the same. They were interested in gender. They were interested in LGBTQ heroes and heroines. They had some really fantastic contrasts. So I think we had, I'm trying to remember who Joan Armatrading was twinned with. It was Ignatius Sancho, that's right, and Joan Armatrading. That's somebody the girls from the Greenwich School chose. But I'm just going to play you. We asked them to make two little 1-minute short videos about the people that they'd researched. I'm just going to play you two of these 1-minute videos.
All seen people from history, some and many a legacy. There were some people who weren't defects. Frank Anatole, a London Eye architect. The death of George Floyd caused an uprising. His death was not left null and void. The two train station pioneers, male and female, the first of their colour, to succeed Winston Samuel and Trudy Aarons. Civil rights, but there were two people we want to talk about. Rawls Soyinka and Neville Mead both changed history.
Lots of falls, even more rises. Both lost their backstory.
Changed the world, plain for us to see. Never gave up, because that's a part of Black history.
One wrote poems, the other loved boxing. Their strength and determination, a mission for us all. You see, they weren't lazy or stupid, as the stereotype calls. Literature and sport, a success, no matter how small.
Football, a word that unites nations, a word that brings to mind passion, dedication, glory, a word that can't only be expressed by a sport, but a story.
25th of February, 2015, a star stepped onto the pitch. Little did he know he would be making headlines outside the football community. Glory followed that first step, first team, England squad, World Cup acclamation. 5 years later, coronavirus hit the world, parting the way for people to lead. Out of the crowds he stepped, leading the way for free school meals, clearing the way for our future today, making things right.
132 years before, on the 28th of April 1888, Walter Tull began his journey, but it wasn't going to be easy. He fought a constant battle with racial prejudice, but that did not stop him. His dreams, his aspirations confirmed on the 1st of September 1909, the second Black player to play pro. 21-year-old Walter Tull only lasted 10 games playing professionally before racism took over. World War I began and he signed up, becoming the first Black surgeon. But on the 25th March 1918, all was lost.
Separated by centuries, but united by leadership. Two different backgrounds, one story. United we stand. Black British history is British history.
Lovely, aren't they?
Football.
Sorry, I'm just going back to Beckford because I just wanted to wrap up really at this point, just to say that we did eventually, after lockdown, get the group of boys from the Harris, what was it they called? Harris Peckham, to come and attend. And they had a fantastic discussion about Beckford and about goodies and baddies and about heroines and heroes and who we should commemorate, what we should do about statues. The majority is interesting. We got into two groups and the majority was saying that they believed in the removal of statues, that they didn't think that these statues should be around. But we had a long debate about how fashions change, how things that we're saying through our commemoration alters, and also what we could do in the future and how they could see themselves getting part of this debate. And lastly, I just want to tie it back to Thorney Island. William Beckford does have a Thorney Island connection because he attended Westminster School. So just in case you wanted to commemorate him in any way, or tell the story of how he made his money. So at this point, I think, Montaz, is there anything else that you wanted to say before we go into a discussion?
Not. I think it's more just kind of, we wanted to pose this not as kind of a means of, we wanted to pose this as a way to stimulate this debate about how we can approach public art to become more inclusive and to become a way of engaging with history through these statues, and how Thorney Island can also kind of embark on this as you kind of have this rich space with so much history and so many kind of public and commemorations in the space that we encounter on the daily, that it would be that we can then kind of counter what Minister Joe was saying, and that how some of the young people were thinking that these statues should be removed, whereas doesn't that constitute in itself another form of erasure? Like, it's kind of, we wanted to engage as many people as possible in this debate to see what we can do to safeguard against new forms of erasure, and counter the historical erasures that have happened through public arts. I think that is my final comment.
So I see we've got some very interesting comments in the chat. I would really welcome everybody to put your cameras on and to take part and to speak to this. I'm sorry that we've clearly perhaps misadvertised our subject, but I don't apologize for anything that we've said. I do feel that this is very relevant to the subject of a commemoration. But if people would like us to engage with what they have to say, we'd love to hear. Trisha, has Trisha Braithwaite left?
I think possibly she has.
Oh, that's a shame. I would have liked to talk to her.
Yeah.
There
was a message that came through from Louise. I think it was just to me. It didn't go in there. She came across a book today called Fallen Idols by Alex von Tunzelmann, about statues being taken down in recent years. Henley Literary Festival event in October, along with another book about Sancho. Thank you, Louise.
Great. I don't know if I could ask Victor to speak, because I'm very interested. I know that Thorney Island members have been involved in, don't know if you call it campaigning, but have been involved in activities to commemorate, for example, Ignatius Sancho, but also in other ways that commemoration is being suggested or proposed in Thorney Island. So I'd really welcome, or Sue, if you wanted to speak to that.
Perhaps if I could go first. I was just particularly going to ask you your views about the proposed Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre in Victoria Tower Gardens, in view of commemoration and all the academic rigour that you brought to the whole presentation this evening, and particularly in light of the National Audit Office's report about the government's proposal, which came out today, but just in terms of that commemoration, because we've been obviously involved in objecting to that government proposal on the grounds of, public art in public spaces, really, and in a Grade 2 listed park, amongst other things.
Who is replying to that? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah. That is too current at the moment. But our views on the Holocaust Memorial are pretty clear. That would you put it there if there were other places just as near which are better for it? And that's, I think, what we one is in the same road, the Imperial War Museum. The other, you could put it on College Green and have a more appropriate one. But in general, in answer to Melissa Joe's question, I think that was very interesting what you were saying, and I was particularly struck by Jan Smuts, and because he, I would guess, would be one of the main candidates for change when it comes to it. But there's also, of course, Lord Clive, who has a huge statue outside the Foreign Office, between the Foreign Office and the Treasury. Now, he, as also recent research, and a lot of people have known it, was a really, really bad person who ransacked India and was being condemned by the House of Parliament, but eventually committed suicide. Then years later, people forgot all this and put up a statue. And I think that is one of the candidates that will be in line when the discussion gets more closer, not least because in the same road, Charles Street, that the Treasury is, and the oversees the Department of the Foreign Office, was where Ignatius Shanso lived and had his shop, and he will be a much more interesting person to memorialize. But all of this debate has come after, I mean, there's a strong case for rotating statues anyway, even before this discussion arose, because you can't keep on putting new statues on. But the debate that's going on now has given it a very important new dimension, and I look forward with great interest to what comes of it.
Thank you, Victor. That's great. I note that Kathy, you've got a raised hand. Did you want to say something?
I'll just unmute Kathy.
Yeah. It's not exactly to what we were saying about the statues, but it's something interesting. On Saturday, I went to a lecture. It was about somebody called Licoricia. And Licoricia has just had a statue put up to her in Westminster. And she was a 13th century Jewish moneylender who's, when her husband died, was left a huge sum of money. And Henry III wanted to tax her, but he made an arrangement with her that if she financed Edward the Confessor's tomb with all the gold and jewels, she'd be free of tax for the rest of her life. And I thought that was really interesting. I did not know that Edward the Confessor, which is Thorney Island, was actually financed by a group who were actually at that time very much discriminated against. So I just thought people don't know that, and I thought she'd be a good person to have a lecture on. But she was saying that just as many British institutions were founded on slavery, most of our cathedrals and churches were actually founded on overtaxing of Jewish people, and anti-Semitism. So I just thought I'd make that point because it's so relevant to Thorney Island. But look out! I mean, look up Licoricia, and she's got a book about it. Thank you.
I'm just making a note of her name. Would you mind putting in the chat the spelling?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Well, Kathy's still.
Sorry, Victor. Say again.
It was Gordon, I think. Was it? No, maybe not. Gordon, are you wanting to say something?
I just wanted to have just to say a few things. I think on statues, I'm a bit ambivalent because statues by their nature are long-lasting things. And so they ought to have some degree of permanence, I think. And I'm very conscious of Montaz's point that we don't want to replace one set of selective statues with another just because it's a different point of view. But I do take the point that a lot of these are controversial and contentious. And so I think it's very good to have the debate. I think also, if you think about architecture as a form of art, you could argue that the whole of the Westminster government precinct is a memorial to British imperialism with the kind of general architectural style and some of the interior deco in the Foreign Office, for instance. So that's another area. But I think also public art that is not statues is much more amenable to this kind of treatment, I think. So there are some murals, certainly around central London, that are very sort of open and commemorative of a wide variety of different people. So perhaps art more generally might be a more fruitful way of getting this sort of idea across. But thank you very much for the talk. I think it's been fascinating.
Thank you, Gordon. That's really, I think that's a very, well, I mean, it's a very interesting point. And also it's exactly what I was trying to do with Illuminated Arts, which is to use art to explore things because it means that you have to participate and engage with it in a different way rather than just going, okay, there's a life. And yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think just to come in as well, I think that's a really fascinating point. I think, yes, art has had a huge, plays a huge role in kind of expanding our perceptions of the public space and our engagement with memory and history in the public space. And also as well, like if you think about not even just kind of commissioned murals, right, but just in terms of the art and the graffiti that people put up around the city claiming back these spaces and claiming back the histories that may not have been put in kind of more traditional or institutional narratives, but using that space to kind of create or influence and kind of set their own mark. But it kind of just to come back onto the point about the permanence of statues, I think in a lot of ways, like that's kind of why I want to kind of engage with statues and see what we can do with statues because of its permanence. And I think because they have in both their kind of their glorification of an individual, but also the kind of the ideals that they harbor as physical objects that remain, there's always going to be a source of contention, whether it's now, whether it's 10 years from now, whether it's 100 years from now, there's always going to be something. And I think there is space for statues to kind of enter into this artistic realm. And I think in kind of being creative about how we can use the permanence of statues to also permanently kind of illuminate the various histories that layer these statues and that are layered within these statues because of who they put them up, who they represent, the histories that are behind them. If we kind of maybe incorporate statues and art in the same sense, maybe we can bridge that gap and use, and again, kind of really personify how statues are those kind of stepping stones into history. I mean, that's kind of, I think, like Minister, I think you agree, it's kind of one of the ambitions we have with the Mongers in terms of future projects, is kind of thinking a bit more creatively about it and using that permanence to our advantage to kind of really draw out those different layers of history and see what can be done. I suppose as well, that's kind of why we're broaching the conversation to see what else can be done, not just in terms of beyond statues, but also with statues. How can we kind of be how can we use public art to really engage with inclusivity in various histories? I mean, I'm looking at it obviously from a historical perspective because I'm a historian, but there's other perspectives to look at it as well. But just, yeah, from that section.
Yeah, exactly. And just to say, of course, art can be just as controversial as people and people's lives. Chris, would you like to speak? Shall I unmute you? Or, yeah.
Yes, thanks. Licoricia, I think it, as it said in the chat, is a statue in Winchester, which was where she was based. The difficulty I have with this is one of perspective, because in these modern times, it seems to be that many groups are identifying as distinct, separate, and finding causes for grievance, and interpreting statues as representing things which they may never have been intended to represent. So if I go back, obviously I'm old now, so if I go back to when I was growing up, these statues were designed to represent ideals like leadership, promoting things which were for the good of the nation, including economically. Or if you take statues of, say, Geoffrey or Colston, they represented philanthropy. They didn't represent slavery. The statues weren't, I believe, raised in order to make a positive statement about slavery. So there's a question of perspective. And I find it sad that now the perspective seems to be so negative. And I noticed that on one of your slides, you asked the question, no more heroes or something. And I think that everyone can be denigrated. Negative things can be found at anyone. And I think that's perhaps why we have now so many more memorials to victims, which personally I find absurd. I find it absurd that we have a memorial to those who died in the Bali bombing, who were just ordinary people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Why do we have a memorial to that? Individuals can be memorialized by their families. If there's some in graveyards or whatever their religion or personal views are, they can be memorialized by the families. I don't see why we need a national memorial. So I find it the future of memorials, of which we already have, I think, rather too many, especially in this area, is, I think, a very difficult one.
You've raised an excellent point, Chris, which is about the philanthropy of the people who, like Beckford, for example, and Jeffrey. And I think, I can't remember the name of the person who, in Bristol, who invested in the Clifton Suspension Bridge, who was equally involved in slavery, although well, he had plantations. I don't know about as many plantations, but we don't know about it, and history doesn't know about him because he wasn't a philanthropist, whereas of course Colston was. So it's a really good point. And this thing of people being seen as good. I mean, Gandhi, a lot of our modern ideas about Gandhi are from Richard Attenborough's film Gandhi, and there are other perspectives on Gandhi as well. Arundhati Roy has written quite negative things about Gandhi. So really, really interesting point, I think, there. Chris, Montaz, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think you raise a really interesting point, and I think it is about perspectives. The perspectives are always changing, and I think one of the things that we are trying to encourage is that with this more creative approach to statues, that changing perspective is acknowledged. But also what is acknowledged is that even if these statues were not designed to, per se, have a positive impact of positive representation of slavery or highlight philanthropy, they inherently do have these histories associated with them. And there's no denying that. And so those things, and also, even if not necessarily, they may not have been intended to highlight them, people who know of this history are conscious of that every time they look at the statue. And so these histories are not ignored, but they're just not acknowledged. And I think there's, yes, it is difficult to kind of memorialize everything, but where in the memorializations that we do have, the history behind it and the individuals should be acknowledged and recognized that, yes, there are elements of the philanthropy and work that has been done that has contributed to the city, which is why the statue's been made. But there are other histories beside that, and to rectify those forms of erasure that occur in that the formation of the statue, right? And I think it's recognizing the relations of power and how these statues actually engage with who is powerful, who has the right to be remembered. And in kind of memorializing certain individuals, we lose a lot of individuals who were still just as important, even if they weren't important, on this grand scheme of things. Every ordinary life has a power, and yes, they'll be memorializing their family, but there's communities, there are spaces, there are individuals, organizations, all these different things that are just as important that should also be remembered. And yes, maybe not every single person needs a statue, but there are other ways. And as the world is kind of becoming more technological, and as we are kind of developing these counter histories, it is emerging that there are different forms of memorialization and commemoration, and in the forms of public art and in the forms of sort of digital art and all of these different spaces. And I think that is something that we shouldn't necessarily be fearful of, or we shouldn't be, we should kind of embrace, because that just ensures that everything is, kind of out on the table, as I suppose is a kind of not an articulate way of putting it, but like that we kind of, yes, that everyone's perspective when they look at a statue or when they look at history is acknowledged, if that makes sense. I hope that is, I'll leave it there.
Jules, thank you. You've said something about the Mayor of London's consultation on statues, and I don't. I think equally it's gone very quiet, hasn't it? About that, I don't know what's happening or how it's being conducted. I mean, again, thinking about younger people and how they will commemorate things, that I can't see statues as such being a popular and fashionable format for recording or remembering our current heroes. So I don't know how that's going to go. I mean, it does seem, again, you know, these things seem to be much more political rather than meaningful to younger people. But I don't know, maybe that will change. Maybe it will change. I would just like to acknowledge one of the comments here, which was saying that we had given a lecture on racism. So I'm just going to go there. Does anybody else feel similarly? Does anybody want to respond to that? I mean, I would just say I'm sorry that I perhaps didn't advertise our subject matter accurately. But I think that these are going to be increasingly important issues, particularly when we're thinking about young people and our population of London. And it won't really be acceptable to have these statistics that I was showing you before of, you know, not having, I think, was it 17% women all over the UK? And that includes quite a lot of queens, mostly Queen Victoria. So I don't think that will be acceptable for the next generation. I don't think it will be acceptable to have only white male artists. I don't think it will be acceptable to have only white men commemorated either. Anybody like to talk about that?
Melissa Jo, did you have any idea amongst the young people that you were working with what they thought commemoration might look like in the future?
Yeah, and people had really interesting ideas, actually. Again, lots of arty ideas, lots of things like talking statues. I don't know if you've ever come across these where you point your phone at them and they give you a history of them, of the statue. But people were I'm just trying to think of the concrete ones. I think people were saying that they would move away from the idea of having statues on the whole. Most of them said they weren't particularly, you know, drawn to or engaging with statues. I mean, obviously for that generation, a lot of things are digital now, and everything will be moving image. So, and moving image is the way to capture people's attention. And I think, I mean, Chris talking about, you know, the statues to victims and so on. People were not particularly, the young people we talked to were not particularly fixated on that and didn't think they were especially meaningful. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. Excuse me. They said that they were no more meaningful than apologies. So, yeah. I think we should perhaps, unless anybody else that has anything else they would like to say.
No, it doesn't look as though, I think quite a lot of the people who are here maybe will certainly be looking at the recording, and I'm sure it will provoke a lot more debate. So I'll hope that you'll both be able to work with us to deal with some of those questions. And quite often, yeah, and quite often that people will email Jules or myself afterwards and say, oh, I forgot to ask this. And that will be very fruitful, because there were several things I took out from it, particularly about what is missing in, you know, in the space, and also to examine our own role as history makers. And much of what you touched on really underlined that, because I don't think we do. And I think those voices going forward will be very important. People will make their views even more known than they are now, and young people in a particularly different way. But I loved your trail of research, and I thought that was so detailed, but it explains so much of the underpinning of your work, but I particularly loved the way you said Thorney Island on the world stage. And that really, really summed it up for many of us, I think. So I wonder, Jules, is it possible that you can unmute everybody, or we can ask everyone to unmute, and thank our speakers so much for their terrific presentation, and we have a lot more to think about. So clapping would be good. And thank you everyone for your questions. We'll be sending around the recording in a few days, and if you do think of any other points, we will put them to our speakers and include their comments in the email which I'll send round. Okay, thanks a lot everyone for joining.
Thank you so much everyone. Thank you.
And thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Melissa, Joe, and Montaz.
And Montaz, that's terrific.